Hey everyone, it's ENDYMION, and I got some more information about Ubisoft I figured I should probably tell you all about. I spoke to some sources which have been in games for a very long time. These sources have worked at Ubisoft in a higher position than you would even expect. Obviously, I promised them I wouldn't say more than that. They didn't even want me to list which franchises they've worked on within Ubisoft. And they also told me not to tell you guys what other IPs they've worked on at other studios, so I promised them that I wouldn't. I could tell the entire time that I spoke to this source that they were very timid and nervous about speaking to me in the first place. Beyond what they told me, I want to also share some other information I've heard about other dev studios like Funcom and their upcoming game Dune Awakening. And even CD Projekt Red, which makes Cyberpunk and Witcher, and then there's some other more public things we can talk about from other websites too. Okay, let's start. Firstly, this source told me that the way AAA is right now is leading to an inevitable gaming crash. They told me that waiting for this crash to happen is pointless because in their opinion, we are already within a gaming crash right now, Western-wise anyways, as they specified. They also told me that they were shocked when they heard that Tencent was in talks to take Ubisoft private or outright buy them. As this source, which I said has a lot of experience in the industry, they claim that Tencent only buys profitable companies that are doing well. And they were puzzled as to why Tencent would go out of their way to buy a company like Ubisoft that has been struggling for so long publicly. Although we both surmised in our audio call that the likelihood is that Tencent isn't really after Ubisoft as a company per se, but it's actually the IPs that they own. Because Ubisoft be damned, their portfolio is full of lucrative IP that is ready for the taking. Assassin's Creed alone is worth over $1 billion most likely, not to mention all the Tom Clancy stuff like Rainbow Six and more. Hopefully if Ubisoft's IPs get bought, maybe I can get a sequel to Child of Light, but I don't have much hope for that these days either. This source is also skeptical about Tencent buying Ubisoft outright because they believe that French laws will step in to stop the acquisition from happening 100%. They believe due to how the French government is, even if Tencent were to somehow acquire more of Ubisoft, the actual identity of Ubisoft would be protected due to its national identity being so closely tied to France. They told me the real reason why many games are failing is down to overspending, inflation, and bloat at studios across the industry. From what they have seen firsthand working on many AAA games themselves, the budgets of these games are completely out of whack about 99% of the time. They told me it's also not any single dev's fault as to how things necessarily turn out in AAA due to how massive these companies are, especially places like Ubisoft. They told me that they roll their eyes whenever they hear anyone on the internet claim that they would do this character design differently or this gameplay mechanic this way if they had the power to do so. Because the reality is that in AAA studios, every single thing that gets added to a game has to go through so many different departments in order for it to get approved, and then there's plenty of times you don't even know who's exactly approving your work these days either. For example, changing a character's design is not actually up to the character artist. As they were saying to me, most character artists in modern gaming studios tend to create upwards of 20 plus variants of any which character in a game. And then the actual decisions are then decided by the higher-ups, which is obvious to everyone. I think we all know that. But they said that they hope by speaking to me that I can relay to the internet that it's not necessarily your artists or designers that are to blame that games like Concord happen. It's this very tiny minority of people at the top who are actually deciding everything. And they told me that it saddens them to see ordinary people at places like Ubisoft who will likely get axed and lose their jobs over decisions that they had no power in making themselves. It's a tale as old as time at this point, sadly. Out-of-touch executives demand something, then the grunts do the work, only for the decision made not to work in their favor. And instead of getting rid of the executive who was responsible for the decision in the first place, the people who were just doing what they were told get fired and blamed instead. They say that they hope players have more compassion for devs in the industry and realize that a lot of the issues plaguing the industry are actually out of a lot of these devs' hands. They did tell me that because of how corporate structure is by design, especially at places like Ubisoft, that speaking out against anything that is considered political or activism-like can and will lead to you getting fired and likely blacklisted as well. They say that there's a very bad case of tone-deaf leadership that has completely disconnected itself from the wants and needs of players across the industry. For example, another source I was talking to told me that CD Projekt Red is in absolute chaos right now, based on who actually is still working there that used to work on the previous games. Apparently, lots of senior talent has already left CD Projekt Red, For example, the director of Witcher 3 has long left the studio, and they've already created their own studio with their own new game as well. Apparently, places like Warhorse Studios, the makers of Kingdom Come Deliverance, they have actually been poaching talent from CD Projekt Red like crazy these past few years. And I was told that problems that are plaguing Ubisoft like diversity hires are also starting to damage and ruin CD Projekt Red as well. According to that other source, CD Projekt has begun to rely heavily on outsourcing to contractors to help with their games because the new talent that they have is nowhere near where they need them to be right now. I was told the reason why the next Witcher is using Unreal Engine instead of the Red Engine that previous games did is largely because most of the senior talent that worked and understood the Red Engine are not at CD anymore, and Unreal is more of a one-size-fits-all sort of engine than many devs are familiar with these days. But in general, we have been seeing lots of recent game studios stating that they're switching to Unreal over their own in-house engines. A great example that was recent was Halo Studios, which was formerly known as 343 Industries, also confirming that they're making the next Halo game in Unreal as well. This is all being done because it's easier to understand, and Unreal makes it much easier to port your games to various consoles. So it's both a business decision, but also because newer age devs are not seasoned with a lot of what made previous games work. But as I'm told, CD Projekt Red right now is in a very tough spot, and they're apparently hoping that their pedigree is going to carry these games to millions in sales. But I truly hope whatever comes from the next Witcher or Cyberpunk, that it isn't a repeat of 2077's launch, because they can't afford another disaster like that again. Circling back to what my Ubisoft insider was telling me, they said another big reason why the game industry is hurting is because the growth that the industry was experiencing has begun to plateau, if you will. Before, we would have multiple years in a row where the industry would be growing 10 to even 15% year over year. Now, the industry is expected to grow about 6% overall by 2028 to become an industry worth over $250 billion. Which, yes, that's a lot of money, but it's a far cry from the mammoth growth of the 2010s. As my sources told me, the real battle right now brewing in these companies is a battle of the eyes. Because of this stagnant growth, the amount of eyes out there, or people I guess you could say, that can be reached is limited to a degree. So this battle of spending billions to make these games to steal players from other live service games has created what I can only call a whirlpool straight to the bottom. These companies are all insanely competitive, we know this, and they are constantly trying to poach players from other games as these live service competitors try to feed their own games instead of other ones. As I'm told, this dev believes that less than 1% of mobile games that are made become profitable as well in today's age. And this trend is sadly not changing. I mean, back in 2014, only around 0.15% of mobile games attributed for about 50% of the gross income from players. Flash forward to now, and the exact number that I was given by this dev, that it's somewhere more like 0.03% of mobile games gaining most of the revenue these days. So that's a lot of flops. I mean, that's pretty much almost all mobile games are a flop at that point. I know that sounds insane, but this trend has had many studios and devs pushing their games franchises to mimic what these successful phone games or live service offerings are now doing. It's also why you're seeing it in the console space and beyond. It's why stuff like Suicide Squad was randomly made into a live service game by a developer who, had really zero experience in that field. It also didn't help that the DEI Sweet Baby stuff turned players away on top of that. But this corporate greed is a big reason why so many game studios and publishers are just bleeding money right now. I asked this insider source what they thought of Sweet Baby, and they told me that they see all of those consulting groups to be plagues in the industry. They said that good, honest devs are paying the price for the moronic decisions that are being made by consulting firms. This also ties into localization. I mean, I've played plenty of games that have sadly had poor localization at times. For example, the new Metaphor ReFantazio apparently also has localization problems, which is unfortunate because one of the hardest things to fix in the gaming industry right now is the localizer problem. Because by and large, these localizers are paid for their work, and they never have to face their own actions when it comes to what they did on the game itself. Metaphor looks great. I don't want people to boycott that game, but it is a shame that it has localization problems in the first place. Same goes with Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, which I'm playing right now, and so many others. All these games and more have varying degrees of localizer nonsense in them. Do I think it should stop you from playing these games entirely? That's up to you to decide. I do think there's a difference between the activism of devs versus the localizers. Because from what I'm told, most localization is done in-house at a single studio that translates most other languages for a single game. They work as contractors mostly. Like I said, once it's done, they don't really face the consequences of their actions. Do I think you're a hypocrite if you complain about localization while also playing games with bad localization? I don't. It's like saying you're a hypocrite because you dislike your government, yet you have to pay taxes to that same government. These sorts of problems are just complicated. In localization anyways, the problem is far harder to change than say when a game is openly just slop, like Dustborn is. Because in Dustborn's case, it's just bad, we can all see that. You don't need a localizer to change dialogue for you to see that Dustborn is just very clearly low quality all around. Like, Dustborn has its villains be conservatives basically. That's not a localizer choice. That was something that was chosen again by the people at the top of that studio, in this case Red Thread Games. I think if people play Metaphor or Dragon Ball, you're not supporting bad localization necessarily, you're supporting the devs behind those games. And in localization changes in the future anyways, it's going to be really hard and insufferable to change. But from what I'm told on these projects and more is that the industry is in a very bad spot when it comes to DEI and propaganda being pushed. Like I said earlier, many of the people I've spoken to say that they will get blacklisted and fired if they were to be discovered talking to me. Which is really sad to see, because what this really means is that these devs are genuinely not allowed to speak their minds about things these days at all, unless it's approved by the hive mind, if you will. This isn't healthy, and frankly, it's pathetic that the industry has instilled this cult-like behavior that every person I speak to has to either seen it all happen or dealt with it themselves. Throw all the massive budgets, localizing, or stagnant growth aside, the activism and fear of retribution by these powerful entity-driven executives is actually what's killing a lot of your favorite games. Everything else I've said are added layers on the crap pie that they're also serving you. As my source told me, they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw stuff like Fair Games getting announced, calling it a hypocritical dumpster fire that they really hope fails because, as they said, it's a game about stealing from the rich that is being made by a company like PlayStation, which is obviously wealthy, and then it stars people of color that are just robbing people of their valuables, which is not a good look. They do think that the industry is being torn apart from opposing angles by all of these problems. Things are way too expensive, yet they also claim that the technology has never been better and should in theory allow for things to be made for less resources than before. But because of the massive overspending and scoping and these modern AAA games that these studios, they end up bloating up in order to fulfill what they actually deem important. More fidelity, more graphical quality, make the water look nice and so on and so forth, while on the other end, another person is in a position they shouldn't be in, is pushing for everything to be gay and diverse, which doesn't help things. And then every decision has to be approved by focus test groups and supervisors who have to send the change first to their boss, who then has to send it to the big bosses at the very top. And by the time one decision gets made on a gameplay mechanic or some sort of asset in-game, the amount of time and money that gets spent to make something happen is ludicrous for what could have been done in that small span of time instead. It's why, as my source told me, they think that indie games will be the ones carrying the industry in the future for sure. Because making AAA games can oftentimes, in their eyes, feel more like it's being done at a snail's pace. It's like trying to build a house, but before you can lay a single brick down, every time you gotta call your boss to call the company owner to tell you that it's okay to lay down that single brick. And you do that every single time until the whole house is done. And most developers who aren't in charge of the things you likely hate in gaming are mostly just innocent in all of this. Most of them, apparently, what I'm being told is that they just come to work, they get told, hey, you gotta do this, make it look good or sound good or play well by this deadline. And then they do it, they send it in, which goes through all the channels that I mentioned before. Then whatever it is they worked on is either okayed or said to change, which then goes back through all the channels again, and then this just leads to this tired, exhaustive process that is needed to make every game in AAA these days. But generally speaking, it's not the developers' faults that these games are ass, mostly anyway. Of course, I am told you will definitely run into many people who shouldn't have the jobs that they have, and once you factor in toxic positivity, this all becomes a powder keg for really bad decisions being made and never being addressed or corrected, and Concord is a perfect example of that. This source also told me another reason why Ubisoft's quality has gone into the stinker is because not only has key talent left, but people like Serge or Sergei Hoskot, I'm probably saying that name wrong, being forced out of the company. Although in this instance anyway, it seems like it was justified as into why someone like Sergey or Serge left Ubisoft. He used to be the chief creative officer at Ubisoft and was responsible for ensuring whatever was coming out of the company would meet a certain quality bar before releasing to the public. However, in 2023, Sergey or Serge Hascott, along with a few other employees at Ubisoft, well, they got accused of sexual harassment against other employees. And this has now led to an ongoing battle behind the scenes where Serge or Sergey and these other devs are currently being investigated and dealing with legal proceedings. It's not 100% claimed that he is guilty of anything yet, well, as of the making of this video anyway, he hasn't been. But from what I'm told, this Serge guy was great at his job, but of course that doesn't excuse the fact that if he is found guilty of what he did, whether he was good at his job or not, he was clearly taking advantage of people, allegedly. If and when that whole situation finalizes, I'll let you guys know, but according to my source, having people like that in terms of what they did job-wise was one of the reasons why Ubisoft was still on track and still giving some quality at least, but obviously they're gone now because, well, you know why now. If it turns out this guy is innocent, he should probably be reinstated, but of course if he's found guilty, well, what's done is done, and it's time to move on. It actually reminds me of the director of Valhalla and Origins, whose name is Ashraf Ismail. Sure, he directed two of Ubisoft's biggest hits, but he was also accused of using his position to leverage sexual favors from female staff members, and ended up getting fired from the company following that lawsuit. It says that he's had a leave of absence following the allegations, and if you go to his LinkedIn, he's still labeled as a creative director at Ubisoft, even though he hasn't technically directed anything that I know of for the past 4 years. Regardless, why I'm bringing this up is because Ubisoft has a tendency to hire people who very clearly use their positions of power to get what they want out of others. My sources also told me for a long time when they worked with Ubisoft that they oftentimes fostered what was called a boys club. And this boys club would lead to many complaints behind the scenes. In Serge or Sergey's and Ashraf's case, they were publicly shown to the world for what they did, but I'm told there's plenty where that came from just at Ubisoft alone. But for years, these sorts of people were having their behavior overlooked by executives as long as they kept delivering quality experiences that would make the company billions. I know this isn't unique to only Ubisoft, but it's something that needs to be discussed regardless. Besides those two people I mentioned, there were actually others that also got fired for harassment as well. For example, there was an Ubisoft PR director named Stone Chin. Yeah, that's their real name, and they were also fired for harassment reasons too, as well as another HR employee named Cecile Cornet, and then Ubisoft Canadian Studios head Yanis Malat. What's also interesting, and I didn't know this at first, is that after looking into this further, it turns out that Ashraf Ismail, the former director of Origins and Valhalla, is actually working in the games industry still, and wouldn't you know, he's working for none other than Tencent. This Ashraf Ismail guy has been working at Timmy Studios for Tencent since around 2022. So this guy, pretty much based on what I'm reading here and how things are lined up, got fired at Ubisoft at a very high up position, and then Tencent pretty much just scooped him up immediately to help consult at Timmy Studios. Apparently this Timmy Studios is also located in Montreal as well, so Ash didn't even have to move in order to continue working in the industry. As of now, there's no mention as to what this new studio is working on. However, based on reports I'm reading here, Ash is working alongside ex-Ubisoft employees at this new studio that is again founded by Tencent. Which of course, if you remember, I reported before that Tencent is allegedly a big reason why Ubisoft is in such dire straits right now. And they're being accused by some of my sources that claim that they are poison pilling Ubisoft into eventually becoming so weak and worthless that they're pretty much begging to be bought up and controlled. Tencent also said about this Ashraf Ismail guy that he's shown professionalism and a consistent eagerness to learn and grow as a person. So this guy pretty much got handed a golden ticket after getting kicked out of the highest tower, which is crazy. I do wonder what they're making. I also assume whenever any info comes out about this game, you can bet that every article is going to reference how this guy got fired for harassment and such at Ubisoft. I also mentioned Funcom very early on in this video about being another studio that's in trouble too. Funcom, if you don't know, is working on Dune Awakening, which is an upcoming survival open world MMO game. Based on what I've been told about this game, there's a lot of mismanagement and chaos behind the scenes surrounding that game as well right now. And by the way, who owns Funcom? Yeah, it's Tencent. From what I'm told, this Dune Awakening game is currently in some inner turmoil struggle between Tencent wanting to put their people in charge of the project, while Funcom's heads want to lead it instead. Apparently the Funcom side wants this Dune game to look more like the recent movies did, but Tencent is pushing Funcom to implement more flashy, oversaturated graphics instead. Apparently Dune Awakening has no real direction as of the last few months, and developers are pissed over there because nothing can really be decided on, and the heads of Tencent and Funcom, they can't seem to agree on anything. So there's another game alongside other dev studios like CD Projekt Red and Ubisoft that are all being in their own versions of chaos right now. And one of the last things my first source in this video brought up is that they are very happy to see these things being talked about so openly. Because according to them, if you speak on diversity in a negative light within game studios, you might as well put the barrel in your mouth yourself and then pull the trigger on your career. Because not being okay with diversity in terms of hiring based on identity and such is being looked at as if you're the evilest person imaginable. This source mostly reached out to me because they wanted me to better understand how games are made these days. They told me that they think many YouTubers don't understand the process properly, and they wanted me to understand that these are real human beings whose jobs are being threatened by the choices of a few crazy people at the top of these studio food chains. They do hope in the future, as they asked me to tell you all, that players don't harass devs as much going forward, because it can be soul-crushing for these individual devs. But ultimately, they do hope that the industry goes back to hiring based on merit and not identity as it is right now. This dev pretty much said that they actually like diversity in gaming, and they do think that it's a net positive for the industry. But they think that the way it's being pushed by many of these core companies are instead being used as a weapon when it should be used more so like a bridge to bring people together. To say this dev was optimistic and compassionate about fellow devs, that would be an understatement. And it sucks that they have to hide themselves in order to talk to me, because from what I gathered here, they just want to make cool games and make players happy. And they're sad when they see passionate people get burned for things that they have no control over in the first place. So hopefully what I explained in this video helped you understand the industry a little bit better than you did before you saw this. This industry is not full of evil people. Sure, there are plenty, and we need to focus on our attention on those people specifically, but we also need to realize that there's a lot of devs that are being caught in the crossfire here, and unfortunately, I don't think this will change the overzealous devs out there who will still attack fans, and when they do, the internet will surely push back. That's been happening a lot, and it will keep happening. Let's be real, guys. But as it stands, Ubisoft and places like CD Projekt Red are apparently in a lot of trouble right now, and I'm at least hoping in CD's case that the leadership is smart enough to course correct before we end up with another Cyberpunk 2077 Part 2 release situation again. But as they say, time will tell. So thank you for watching, subscribe, thanks to my supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.